So today's presentation is a reporting of the findings of a funded and published research study titled "The Impact of Biophilic Design on Student Success." And what we're going to present today is a little bit different from typical knowledge, I think, that is shared at Learning Spaces Collaboratory. My experience with Learning Spaces has been since about 2010, and much of what we talk about is the learning experiences that happen in a learning environment, and then we design learning space to afford those learning experiences. This is a little bit different. This is about understanding human biology and trying to maximize the facility of human biology as a driver to design learning space. So a little bit different. So with that, we'll move ahead. We're going to introduce the researchers that were involved in the study, and we're going to talk first about the neuroscience basis for much of biophilic design, and then share some recent research studies that link human performance and positive performance with biophilic design. And then we're going to talk about the study and the findings, and then we'll wrap. Okay. So first of all, we need to acknowledge our donors, our benefactors on the project. Without their help and their funds, we could not have done the study. My name is Jim Determan. I'm a principal with Craig Gaulden Davis Architects, and principal investigator on the study. Tom?
So I'm Tom Albright. I'm a neuroscientist at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies. I've spent my career studying the brain basis of visual perception. That is how we turn patterns of light cast on the back of the eye into perceptual experiences. And some time ago, I got interested in the problem of architecture, and I met Jim at a meeting at which he was intrigued by some of my ideas about the relationship between visual perception and architecture, and we proceeded from there with the study that we'll describe today. And let's see, let's go to the next slide.
Well, let me introduce first Bill Browning, who is another partner in the study. He's the founding member of Terrapin Bright Green. He's a sustainability and biophilic designer. Also a co-principal investigator is the Dean of the School of Architecture and Planning at Morgan State University, Dr. Marianne Akers. Paul Archibald is a assistant professor of social work who led the stress part of our study. Catherine Martin Dunlop, the director of the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning at Morgan State, and Valerie Carrillo, who's an architect that without her help, we couldn't have gotten the experiment done. So those are the researchers, learning objectives, and let's talk about the neuroscience. Tom.
Right, so as I mentioned, I became interested some time ago in the problem of architecture and how neuroscience might relate to this. And let's go to the next slide. This is a natural question. It's a question that many people pose when I put the words neuroscience and architecture in the same phrase. Why is neuroscience important for architecture? And there's a fairly obvious and a simple answer to that question, which is outlined in the next slide. The design, production, use, and appreciation of and engagement with works of architecture necessarily rely upon human sensation, cognition, and behavior. That's fairly obvious. Sensation, cognition, and behavior are products of the brain. But what we'd like to know is a little bit more about how those processes, those products of the brain, enable us to interact with architecture. What are the mechanisms by which that happens? Now, just to frame this whole discussion, I should start out by saying that I am not an architect. I've never had any formal training in architecture. I'm a neuroscientist. I spend a lot of time talking to architects like Jim, and I have been for over 15 years now a member of an organization that was based in San Diego, where I live, called the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture. And through my interactions with these architects, I've come to believe that neuroscience can identify principles of brain organization and function that may be relevant to building design. And from those principles, designers may ultimately find brain-based explanations for things that work and may develop novel design strategies. Next slide. So any architect, again, I'm not an architect, but any architect designing a work will consider several important factors. They're listed here. The site, the materials, the budget, the climate, increasingly sustainability is an important factor. But implicit in all of this, it may not be explicit on your checklist, but implicit in all of this is biology. We design buildings for people, at least for the most part. And those buildings have to conform to what we know about biology. Next slide. And so the question is, and then plenty of examples, simple examples of that. We incorporate lighting so that we can do tasks adequately, so vision works. We set the counters at the right height. We have HVAC systems for ventilation and so forth. But that then raises the question, are there mind-brain requirements for architecture? Are there things that we should be doing to the built environment to optimize the operations of the brain for the task that confronts us? Now, neuroscience is an umbrella for a large set of academic disciplines. It's a field that's grown by leaps and bounds over the last 50 years. It's really a juggernaut of modern biomedical research. Some of those academic disciplines are illustrated here. The obvious ones are psychology, biology, cognitive science, genetics, anatomy, computer science, physics, engineering, and philosophy. And the goal of all of this is to try to explain how the brain, that squishy bit of material on the upper left-hand side of the slide, gives rise to complex human behavior. And the question that arises from that is, can neuroscience tell us anything useful, this discipline, this juggernaut, anything useful about architecture and design? And the way I like to think about this is that neuroscience, next slide please, neuroscience reveals that the brain is an information processing device. And information processing devices have certain properties. They acquire information from the world through the senses. The brain organizes, integrates, and interprets that information. That is, it helps us know what things are. It labels acquired information with value and affect. That is, we have emotional responses to the things that we see. The brain assigns utility to acquired information. That is, we know what the purpose of stuff is in our environment. And the brain stores all of this information, back a slide, stores all of this information for later use. The brain uses newly acquired or stored information to guide our actions. And so with that framework, we can begin to see how the system works and how it might be relevant to the problem of architecture. And I have focused on the visual system. We have lots of sensory modalities, but the visual system, the visual brain is a case study for architecture. This is the sensory system that, that scientists know the most about. And at least in primates, and which of course we are, it is the sensory modality that's most heavily used. Next slide. So this is what I call an environmental theory of visual perception. It's built on a number of ideas that have been around in the literature for some time now. And I'll start with two premises. First is the visual environment, that's both the natural environment and the built environment, has measurable statistics. They're things that you can go out and measure about the properties of light, the brightness, the movement of air, the chemicals in the air, and so forth. And the brain has highly specific organizational properties for representing the statistics of the visual environment. Those, I don't have time to go into the details of those, but those are things that are well known from studies of vision largely over the past 50 years or so. And from those 2 points, we can develop a hypothesis, which is that the organizational and functional properties of the visual brain facilitate the processing of certain statistical regularities in the visual environment. And that hypothesis has implications for design. So let's go. So I'm going to just cut to the chase here and focus on really the outcome of a lot of this thinking. And the thinking, again, originates from the neuroscience of visual perception and knowledge of the physical properties of the world that we live in. And I'll speak about two kinds of beauty, which is a kind of a presumptuous thing for me to do, but it is interesting. The sense of order versus perceptual improvisation. So let's first consider what I call the sense of order. And I should say this is not a term that I invented. It's a title of a book by a man named Ernst Gombrich, who many of you may know is one of the great art theorists and art historians of the 20th century, a sort of towering figure in art history. So the sense of order. So this is just a simple illustration of how your brain organizes certain types of information. So there's a semi-random pattern on the left-hand side of the slide, and at the arrow, and each of these things are identical. They're all sort of Oreo cookie-shaped things. And there's an arrow on the diagram that points to one of these, and you should be able to trace. It's just to get you started, it's up and to the right of that particular Oreo. You can see a sequence of these. Now, if we can take a step back, Jim, you can see that this, as we say in the visual world, this pops out, this pattern, and it pops out because of the approximate collinearity of these Oreo cookies. If we arrange them in a different order, and this is the right-hand side of the slide now, so now they're all a different arrangement relative to one another, and you see it no longer pops out. So your brain, because of its native organization of the way it processes visual information and contours, pulls these things together in a form that makes it very easy for you to see them. Next slide. Now, the natural world, the world in which we evolved, taps into these organizational properties of the visual brain. You don't have to look far in the natural world to find these sort of gradually changing contours, which are exactly the sorts of relationships between contour orientation that are going to excite the cells in the brain through the mechanism that I illustrated in the demo before us, waves of grass in a meadow on the bottom right, or veins of a leaf on the upper left. Now, the built environment does the same. Next slide. These are examples from the built environment in which architects have designed things that have exactly these properties, these gradually changing orientations. The example on the left is the Fay Jones Cooper Memorial Chapel in Arkansas, which has these gently sloping, I'm not an architect, so I can't tell you what those things are called, but these gently sloping things. Jim probably knows the name of those things. Anyway, the point is this gradual changes in the contour orientation. This is in the center is the north rose window of the Cathedral of Notre Dame, which I hope is still intact. And it has also these gradually changing contours. The orientation gradually changes, and these are exactly the sorts of stimuli that should excite these cells in our visual brain. Here's some more examples. This is perhaps my favorite example, the cable-stayed bridge. This is the most commonly built highway bridge in the world today. And there are a lot of engineering and material science reasons why that's true, advances in both of those fields, but it's also almost universally regarded as an extremely beautiful structure. There's an example from France on the upper left. The one on the lower left is right down the street from where I work in La Jolla, California, at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography. And this is a Calatrava Bridge in Jerusalem, the Cords Bridge, which is just sort of spectacular. And the argument is the beauty of this comes in part from the fact that these gradually changing orientations are selectively stimulating a group of cells in the visual brain. Next slide. So to define the sense of order a little bit more specifically, it's a regularity of patterns in space and time that facilitates detection, spatial understanding, and fosters an ease of visual processing. And you could imagine that there are many conditions under which, many task conditions under which an ease of visual processing would be beneficial, particularly in a learning environment. So that's the sense of order, and I'll move to the second form of beauty. And to get to this one, I have to summarize this brief model, very simplified model of how your visual system works. On the lower part of the slide, you'll see a pathway that runs from the retinal stimulus to the visual cortex. That's the part of your cerebral cortex that's the processes visual information. And that visual cortex gets input both from the retina, and it also gets feedback from the memory store, things that you've seen before and have stored in memory. And your perceptual experience at any point in time is a combination of those two inputs. Most people, if you ask them, they'll tell you that, well, I see the thing that's in front of me, but in fact, your perceptual experience is driven in part by the thing that's in front of you and in part by what you know to be true based on your prior experiences with the world, such that under most conditions, your perceptual state varies somewhere along a continuum. This is at the continuum at the top side of the slide, a continuum between pure stimulus on the left and pure imagery on the right. Pure stimulus is a difficult situation to be in because you don't know what's out there, what's coming onto your retina. You can't interpret things. You don't know what the utility of the patterns of light on the back of your eye are or what causes them. So that's a bad place to be. Pure imagery is also a bad place to be because under those conditions, you're simply hallucinating. You're not connected with the world in front of you. Under most conditions, your perceptual experience is a combination of those two influences that are coming, again, from the retinal stimulus and from the memory store. Next slide, please. So this is a demonstration, a simple demonstration of what I just described to you. Most of you, when you look at this, will see an abstract pattern. It's nothing but a black and white pattern of spots. And if I ask you to tell me whether you see something meaningful in that pattern, most of you will say, well, no, I don't. Or you might confabulate something. People have told me they see all sorts of funny things in this pattern that aren't what I want them to see. Now, I'm going to give you a piece of information that will enable you to make sense of this. And before I do that, what I want to say is that your brain, when looking at the stimulus, is improvising. It's sort of flipping through the Rolodex of memory, trying to find some piece of information that will enable you to get purchase on this stimulus, to make sense of it. Because our survival, generally in the world we evolved in, our survival depends upon that ability to make sense of patterns that fall on the retina. And so we try various options on a probabilistic, in a probabilistic way in order to make sense. So now I'm going to give you a little piece of information. Next slide. This is also a fairly abstract pattern, but you should be able to see the face of a man and the upper torso of a man. I call him Che Guevara. And so now let's go back to the original slide. I think it's the next slide, Jim. And there we go. And so hopefully most of you now, with that little clue, your brain has now zeroed in on a solution to this problem. I've given you this extra piece of information, this context that has enabled you to now see this pattern, this abstract pattern, in a very different way. And I didn't ask your permission before showing this to you, but I've modified your brains, and I believe I've modified them forever. You can't go back. I might tell you, well, this is not Che Guevara, it's a pile of dirty laundry, or it's a map of the Aegean Islands, but you're always going to see Che. You're stuck with it because your brain has zeroed in on this through this process of improvisation. Next slide, Jim. And there are lots of these kinds of phenomena are called pareidolia. If you Google that, you'll find lots of examples. This is one of the most common in our world that most people are familiar with, clouds that look like things. You should all see the poodle leaping across the clouds. I hope so. And of course, there's not really a poodle in the clouds. And if you think there is, then you have a different kind of problem. But this is, it's truly an abstract pattern. It's just noise. And yet our brain, the visual brain, is a pattern finding machine. We can't stop this improvisation. We're constantly trying to identify the cause of that pattern of light on the back of our eye. And the result of this is that we see things in noise. Next slide. This is the infamous Virgin Mary cheese toast. This is, you may see in the middle of this, an image of the Virgin Mary. I see an attractive young woman. I wouldn't say it's the Virgin Mary, but yeah, honestly, this is just a toasted cheese sandwich. It's nothing but noise. And again, we impose, it's embedded in plexiglass because the person who found it felt it was important, but it's just noise. And we impose our improvisation on these noise patterns. It's a matter of survival. So here we go. Perceptual improvisation, my definition is it's an active search through memory for information that enables identification, recognition, and spatial understanding of novel stimuli. Next slide. And just to sort of wrap this up with a few examples, the sense of order, again, this is elicited by simple, regular repeating forms that activate specialized neuronal systems that have evolved because they facilitate detection of natural stimuli that confer a selective advantage for survival and reproduction. And there are a couple of examples from the natural world shown on the top there. Examples in the built environment, structural understanding is immediate with these simple forms. This is the Sydney Opera House on the lower left. On the lower right are two vases that were designed by Eva Zeisel, who is lived to be 105 or so, and was throughout most of the 20th century was one of the greatest designers of things. There's a visual ease and easy adjustment. And again, coming back to the fact that I called these definitions of beauty, I will call this conventional beauty. It's something that's very satisfying in a certain way. There's an ease of processing, and in that sense, they're beautiful. The next slide, please. And these are examples of perceptual improvisation. Complex, it's elicited by complex forms with irregular statistics. There's no specialized neuronal system for detection of these things. Detection confers little direct value for survival and reproduction. The examples, you probably don't have the slightest idea what the examples are at top. On the top left is, that's what the state of Nevada looks like from a satellite. And the one on the upper right is a photomicrograph of some part of the body stained with a color stain. Again, these are meaningless patterns. And so our brain is not designed to detect these things. And what we try to do is figure them out. What are these things? Examples from the world we live in, the built environment, are shown on the lower part of the slide. Structural understanding is difficult by nature. There's visual intrigue, and this is the important thing about this. This is why this is so appealing, why art museums, modern art museums are so appealing. There's visual intrigue, there's easy arousal, this is Gombrich's term. It elicits imagery, improvisation, and creative thought. That's the Seattle Library by Rem Koolhaas on the lower left, and that's, I always forget the name of this artist. Anyway, it's a famous piece of 20th century art. I regret that I can't remember it. But if I showed you that piece of art, your brain is probably running wild trying to identify what that is in that piece of art. And of course, most of these pieces of art are not meant, and intentionally by the artist, not meant to represent anything. It's just a pattern of sensory stimulation, but we can't avoid this tendency to try and improvise and identify what it is. And if I'd shown you a photograph of the coastline in Santorini in Greece, and then showed you this painting, you would see Santorini in that painting. I've done it, it works. And that's what happens in art museums all the time. So these two types of beauty give rise to a great deal of satisfaction in the world that we live in. And I would say that in learning spaces, there are benefits of both. And we tried to incorporate those kinds of things in the experiment that Jim is going to tell you a little bit more about. I think I'm at there's maybe one more slide. Yeah, this is where I work, which is a remarkable building in and of itself, the Salk Institute for Biological Studies, which was designed by the great 20th century architect Lou Kahn. And this is a quote. Most of what Le Corbusier wrote, at least for my simple mind, is inscrutable. But this is a beautiful quote. The architect must determine the various movements of our heart and of our understanding, that is, of the mind, for it is then that we will experience the sense of beauty. Okay.
Thank you, Tom. So we see a lot of connection in what Tom talks about with biophilic design. So first, let's talk about biophilia. What is it? Why do certain places make us feel good? Biophilia was really popularized by E.O. Wilson back in the mid-'80s. Is the innately emotional affiliation of human beings to other living organisms. It is an innate connection between humans and nature. And that feeling that you have when you go outside into this kind of green space, when you relax and you feel calm, and it actually rejuvenates you, and it actually improves your cognition when you're in these kinds of spaces. That's real. And a lot of what we just heard explains why we have that reaction. So we want to just talk about a couple of studies. There have been 40 years of research studies about biophilic design, mostly in healthcare and workplace environments. Very few in learning space, and none that has ever connected or made a strong connection between biophilic design and learning. Okay, some have nibbled around the edges, and we're going to look at some of those just to see where we fit. But a couple of things that are important for our study, fractals. Fractals are a pattern that self-replicates and at different scale. So a snowflake, certain trees, leaves of a tree. Fire is a statistical fractal. The wave pattern of waves hitting a beach is a statistical fractal. And we like watching these things. These things make us feel good when we see these patterns. You'll notice at the top I'm referencing the studies and the author in the study that came up with this. And these are slides by Terrapin, Bright Green. This is important because another statistical fractal is the shadow pattern of a tree on a surface. And there is a strong visual preference that humans have to look at that pattern than at non-fractal patterns, like you see over on the far right of all these images, a non-fractal pattern. We much prefer to look at these, okay? Why is that? Probably some of the reasons that Tom talked about earlier. Now, back in 1995, Stephen Kaplan did a important study that talked about directed attention fatigue, which has great implications to learning. You've seen students with their head down on their desk. Someone has been talking to them for more than 10 minutes. Jeannie Narum always taught me, don't ever speak for more than 10 minutes without getting the audience to talk. So that's a directed attention fatigue. And when you have the opportunity to take a break, to look out the window. Remember architects when they said the teachers don't like looking out the window? We need that. We need to look out the window and take a positive break, right? They describe it almost as a being in a condition of soft fascination. You're taking a break by looking at nature. And if you look at that, the next study is going to tell us this. This is by Lee and Williams in 2015. When you have the opportunity as a person that's under direct attention fatigue to look out at, say, a roof, and I have the option of looking at just an asphalt roof, or I can look at a green and flower colored roof. This experiment was done, and if you look at that for 40 seconds and then come back, those that looked at the natural roof were much higher performers at the task. Why is that? There was a study done in Barcelona in 2015 by thousands, 2,500 or more school children, that what they did was they compared school children that lived in a vegetated canopy, heavy canopy environment and walked through that type of environment, and then there was a lot of vegetation around their school, with those that lived in an urban environment and didn't have that where they lived or at their school. And what they found is that the working memory of students in the vegetated environment was far outpaced the memory of those from an urban environment. So very interesting studies. And those are basically the studies about learning space, not a lot about how does biophilic design really help us learn. So in the last 40 years, there have been about 14 or 15 design devices that are called biophilic design. And they can be categorized. Some of these are about the nature in space. In other words, I want to put a plant in my space or have, you know, some kind of small water element in my space. That's nature in the space. Natural analogs is really a lot about what Tom talked about. Objects and materials that replicate the patterns and the contours of nature. And then there's the nature of space. Some of you may have heard of prospect and refuge. If I can see a long distance, I feel safe because I can see there's no imminent threat. And if I'm sitting in a big learning commons and it's full of people and a lot of buzz, I may want to go sit in a corner with maybe a little something over my head, you know, my refuge to feel more comfortable. These are learned reactions that really come to us from evolution. So I forget what the year was, but back in the 2000s, Terrapin Bright Green wrote this report called The 14 Patterns of Biophilic Design. And it really convenes all of the knowledge and the studies about biophilic design in the last 40 years. And it creates a really nice guide of how to incorporate these design devices into learn into all sorts of space. So in our experiment, well, let me present this first. Here are all the 14 patterns on the left side, and at the top you'll see that each of these were studied, and you can see the human reaction: stress reduction, improved cognitive performance, and improved emotion or mood. And wherever you see words, this is a study that's been done that strongly associates this this pattern with this human response. So as you can see, biophilic has been around for a long time, it's been studied. It's about time we study in learning space. So now let's look at the experiment. Now, like before I go to the next slide, like any experiment, just like how they tested the COVID vaccine, we take one classroom and we enrich it with biophilic enhancements, and another classroom, and we leave it generally alone. And then we compare the performance and the reactions of the human subjects in those two classrooms and draw some conclusions about the difference. Now, when Tom and I were conceiving this experiment, we usually like to do our research in higher education environments. And Tom wanted to go much younger. And at the time, I remember, Tom, you said because young brains are more plastic. So more impressionable, right? We can make a bigger difference. We can move the needle more with a younger brain. So this study was done in middle school. Now, for those of you that are mostly Learning Spaces Collaboratory deals with higher education, fear not. This is about biology and human biology. And if it works in middle school, it's going to work for every human on this planet, no matter what level of education we're talking about. So this was the goal of the study, to test and understand the contribution of biophilic learning space to reduce student stress and enhance learning outcomes. Two things. Try to be very specific in our research. This is the location of the study, Green Street Academy. This was a building that I led a team to renovate back in 2015. It's about 130,000 square feet. And it's a building that was built in 1925. So of course, all of the windows are in the wrong orientation. They're all facing east and west rather than north and south, which creates part of the problem. But we studied a 6th grade math class in this school as our biophilic human subjects. Now here's a photo of a typical classroom in this building. And what do you notice? All the windows are shaded with opaque blinds. You have no daylight coming into the space. You have no view to nature. that's one thing, and this is pretty typical. Teachers want to darken that space to project images, and so in September they go in and they shut the blinds, and usually they don't go open until June. Not to fault the teacher, they've got a lot of work to do, and they don't want to be worried with changing the daylight in the space. And also look at the piers in between the windows, covered with stuff. Look at the other walls. Jeannie, these are whiteboards from floor to ceiling so that students can stand and make their knowledge public. And the teachers have covered all of that space with teaching guides. And when Tom Albright saw this, he said, this is doing more damage to the kids than good. It is over visual stimulation. There's no relief for the eye. So this is the control classroom. Now, what did we do to enrich the biophilic classroom? We picked 3 things. We were guided by Bill Browning. You don't want to overwhelm people with biophilic patterns. We wanted to do a couple of things. We wanted to first of all, we were making these interventions, right? So immediately you could do this as a renovation project. But we wanted to be minimal. We wanted to be cost effective so that these could actually be solutions that work for a lot of dollar-starved school districts. So the first thing we chose was visual connection with nature. As you can see at the top, this has been studied very, very often, and has produced stress reduction, cognitive performance improvement, and more positive emotion and mood. So that was an easy one. We also selected dynamic and diffused light. What that means is it's almost like, when you walk under the dappled light of a tree, you get that sense of stress relief. We wanted a changing daylight in the space, and we wanted to be so that's the dynamic part, and then the diffused part was that always a soft light is coming in. And then here's a lot of what Tom talked about, the biomorphic forms and patterns. So you're looking there at the center of the sunflower, and what do you see? You see the golden spiral. You see the Fibonacci sequence. When we look at a radial pattern like that, it is one of the patterns that Tom writes about that is that stress relief that we react positively to as human beings. And then the other patterns you see the slightly changing lines of the cornrows there in the field. These are all a lot of the patterns that Tom speaks and writes about. So those are the 3 patterns. We get a bonus pattern, but when we plant a garden outside the window, if you choose the right trees that bloom and they keep their leaves in the wintertime so that it catches the breeze, that peripheral vision will catch a non-rhythmic movement like a bird or butterfly or insect or wind, and it'll draw the student's attention to look out that window wall. And just like we talked about, that peaceful break from the directed attention fatigue, if you look out and you look at that, if your attention goes from 5 meters and goes out past 30 meters, and you look at that natural scene for 40 seconds and come back, your attention has been restored, and you're able to absorb more of the content that's being presented in the classroom. So here's an image of the biophilic classroom. You will note the first thing we did was plant the garden outside the window. This was an extravagant garden that was planted. It does not have to be. We had a very generous donor. And then we took out the opaque mini blinds and we put up weaved shades that will always allow a soft light to come in. And we also imprinted the shades with the shadow of a tree. That's that fractal pattern that human beings have responded to well in previous research. Okay, and then we motorized these shades and put them on a solar cell. So the teacher doesn't have to be involved. When these east-facing windows, when the sun moves away, the shades go up a little bit. And by the time the sun goes all the way, the shades go all the way up. And then you've got maximized view to nature and maximum daylight coming into the space. Tom and our artist designed this wallpaper frieze that went around the top of the whiteboards. on the other 3 walls. And this is a biophilic pattern. It's one of these patterns that both the Salk research and also biophilic research says we respond well to. We found a prairie grass pattern in an interface carpet and put that on the floor. And we found this 3-dimensional ceiling that had ribs in it, and they carved the bottom almost like a wave. So we did all these things. We had the 3, 4 biophilic elements, and then we, and here's just some images of the actual space itself. You can see one condition that we gave the teacher was no teaching aids on the walls. Let's find a different way to do it and give this visual relief to the students. There's the floor pattern. Here's our design for the garden. And you can see some of the trees that we selected, things that would bloom and draw habitat. There's the actual garden. Students helped install it. And this is the window of the classroom right up here, just to the right of that rear entry. So any research is only as good as its assessment. So what did we do? We interviewed the student and instructors after the year-long research. We gave them surveys, both about their own impressions about their own stress and their ability to learn in both classrooms, the control and the biophilic classroom. We measured their stress using a heart rate variability meter that they clipped on their finger, and it went to a smartphone, and then we captured the data in the cloud, and we'll see results of that. And then we actually used a different control to look at learning outcomes, and I'll just very quickly go over just a capsulized version of these results. First, let's ask the students what they thought their own impressions were about the space.
It gives me a more purpose to learn, knowing that I'm like in a good environment. Like I'm sitting like by the light, so it's like better for me to understand or like view what's going on in the classroom, and I'm more comfortable in the classroom.
Well, along with the floor and the light and stuff, it just makes it easier for me to focus more and get back into what I'm doing. Because it kind of draws out the distractions and stuff that might be happening around me, so it can make it easier for me to stay focused on what I'm doing.
Do these things help you learn math, do you think?
It relaxes me.
The what?
Relaxes.
Relaxes you? How does it that?
Because with the light of the sun makes it concentrate better instead of having the regular eyes.
Most of the time, my stress level is very calming. Nothing really to stress about.
So in other classrooms, you stay stressed. But in this math classroom, tell me again?
It goes down and I can refocus, calm down. It's too stressful to get back to work.
Do you ever feel stressed in that classroom?
For the test room,
No. Good for you. Never. You just take the test and you're done.
yes.
Wow.
The blinds, how they go and now automatically, so it's when there's light.
How does that affect your learning?
Mainly because I have really bad eyes, so it can make it easier for me to see certain things on the board.
What I want to see is the windows.
Windows.
There's so light coming in outside.
How does that compare to other classrooms? Those windows. First go in that classroom.
And then my other classes, the blinds are always clean.
No. Do you prefer them open? That's not right.
The ceiling,
What about?
The ceiling.
those ladies, the ceiling,
Why do you like that?
the column.
You what?
With you turn it down, and the other pulls it down, especially when it's hot.
I think children must be biophilic. And did you hear Kervin say, the wave cooled him down? That's funny. me go to the next one. Now the teacher's impressions.
Describe what it was like to teach in this class. What are your thoughts about this classroom? What do you think about it?
The room is beautiful. Like it feels very homey. Feels like it's a comfortable space to be in. The windows, being able to get that natural light in here at different times of the day is really, I really enjoy the windows. Outside, the scenery, now that it's spring, it's all nice and everything has bloomed. You can see all the trees and things outside. So it's a space you can easily just get caught up staring outside. And I've noticed that students do that too, and then they quickly kind of get themselves back together. Like it helps with kids that are having a difficult time and they just kind of space out for a minute and then they come back.
Yeah.
We just did our state testing part last week, and I noticed earlier this week actually for math, and there was a lot of them, they wanted to face the direction of the windows during testing. Usually they face either the rear of the room or the front of the room, but they all voted to face the windows so that they can look outside. And that, I don't know if it was the swaying of the trees or whatever it was outside going on, it seemed to kind of calm them. So they were less anxious when they were taking the assessment. And that part I really like, because they didn't seem as tense as some other scholars are when they just have to face the wall during testing.
Did you notice anything different about the students' behavior, performance, and mood?
Their mood was, it just seemed like they would come in a rush and frantic and chaotic, but then after a while they would just kind of calm themselves down. And it could be attributed to the room, it could be the lighting in here, it could be because everything is a little softer in here. A lot of behavior shifts in the spring. I don't know if it's a hormonal thing or what it is, but their behavior seems to shift in the spring, sometimes for the better, sometimes it's just a little different. But I think being in a setting where they are, it's kind of like surrounded by like a lack of chaos, a lack of clutter, a lack of just a lot of extraneous stimuli, they kind of calm it down.
Did you notice anything different about your stress level, attention level, behavior, performance?
It is calmer in here. So a lot of times I will just turn the classroom lights off, let the natural light in, and kind of calm myself, especially if it's a class that can be a little more rambunctious than the others. I will sit in a student desk and stare out the window myself if I need to. I think, to me, the space is really nice. Like I said, I've said a few times that it feels homey. Like I used to live in a wooded area, so it's just kind of like, oh, this is peaceful. I've had other teachers come in here just to calm themselves down. They don't want to eat in here because they don't want to get anything on the carpet, but they will come in and say, I actually do feel calmer in this space. Like it's really comfortable being in a space like this versus what they're normally used to.
Always good to hear directly from them, you know, what their thoughts are. And I just say, it always gets me when I hear the students voted to face the windows. I love that. That was a great interview. So, okay, still in the affective domain, we did surveys. So prior to the experiment, by the way, the experiment lasted about 4 months. And we'll see the months in the stress testing. We had 2 classrooms. We had 19 participants in each classroom. And you can imagine the amount of permission we had to get to use human subjects from parents and the school district and the students themselves. So we had 19 in each for the stress testing, and then for the surveys. So the students were surveyed about their perceptions of their own stress. And there was a pre-test, that's the blue bar, and then the post-test is the green bar. And as you can see, in both cases, there's the biophilic classroom and the control classroom is on the right. The stress level, their perceptions of their stress was less in the biophilic room than in the control classroom. And at the end of the year, both stresses, their perception of their stress went down. So that's interesting. Then we did another survey that asked students about the learning space, and you can see the 3 scales at the bottom. The blue bar is the biophilic classroom, the gray is the control classroom. And as you can see, we got more positive responses all around from the students in the biophilic classroom. So that's the affective domain. Next, we tested stress. And this was really good quantitative data. We had the 2 classrooms, 19 students in each. Each student had their own stress meter that measured variable heart rate, and they had a smartphone to gather the data and send it to the cloud. So first, a little bit about HRV, heart rate variability. We're not measuring heart rate. We're measuring the distance between the upbeats in the heart rate. The reason that's important is that when I take a breath, my heart rate goes up. When I exhale, my heart rate goes down. So in a non-stress, calm condition, the heart rate varies, okay? If I'm bearing down, the heart rate tends to be more regular, okay? If I'm less stressed, my heart rate tends to be more regular. So when my variability of the heart rate is higher, I'm less stressed, or my stress is being reduced. So this meter gives you a number that measures your HRV. A higher number means I'm less stressed. A lower number means I'm more stressed. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but that's important to know. Here's what that looked like. We had 2 graduate students from Morgan State that facilitated this. The students were tested 3 times a week for 4 months in both classes. They were tested the first minute and the last minute of class. Why did we do that? Kids come in with all sorts of stress from various other stimuli. We're not measuring how stressed each student is. We're measuring what is the difference in their stress after they've been exposed to the environment. I want to know, did the biophilic environment reduce stress from between the first and the last minute versus the control classroom? How did they compare between the first and the last minute? So this is what that looked like for 19 students. Not every student participated. This student wanted to. He's sticking his finger in a stapler. So not every student participated. I don't know why we chose this photo. Here's some of the raw data. Here's a student from the biophilic classroom, and their names were not known to us. In fact, we didn't even see the students, the grad students did. And so this is student number 12 in the biophilic classroom. As you can see, here's 2 tests on March 4th, 2019. First and second, the duration of the test and the HRV. So on this first test, the second test was negative. We don't like that. Remember, the higher the number, the less stressed you are. This student was more stressed after he left than he was when he started. But if you look at the whole month, typically, he's much less stressed at the end of the exposure to the environment, much less stressed. So this is how we gathered the data. And here's the results of it. February, March, April, and May. We've got a gray box for control classroom and a blue box for the biophilic classroom. These numbers here are the number of tests that were done that month. It's a lot of testing, significant number of testing. And we measured the difference, the average HRV score change for the whole class for that the daily average change, okay, for the month, daily average change. So there was a change, there was positive change always, but in the control classroom, you can see the number that was the change. And then look at the biophilic classroom. The stress reduction was more. And each month it got more. The difference became more. And then look at April. Look at the difference between the stress reduction in the control room and the stress reduction in the biophilic classroom in April. And I said, what happened in April? Were they doing tests in the control and we didn't have any tests? And the teacher said, no. It was just spring. It was spring. Everything bloomed. Everything got green. Remember what the teacher said, kids change a little bit in the spring. So, and then they came back down to earth a little bit in May, but still a significant difference between the control and the biophilic classroom. Kids in the biophilic classroom were significantly less stressed. Their stress reduction was much higher. Significant. And then we looked at the monthly average change. So the cumulative value of that stress reduction was very significant over the month. Okay, that was stress. Now let's look at learning outcomes. We changed the control for the learning outcomes to make it a little bit more rock hard science. The biophilic classroom was made biophilic, and we had about 125 students in 5 classes that went through that biophilic classroom in our study year. The year before, we had about the same number of students. It was the same teacher, the same base classroom, the same course content, same solar orientation, same cohort of kids. Of course, the kids were different, they're always different, but the demographics of the cohorts were exactly the same. The only difference in this piece of the experiment was the biophilic enrichments in the classroom in the biophilic year. So we're comparing the biophilic year kids to the year before. Now, we didn't use just straight up grades to compare because this can be subjective. But this school uses a diagnostic test that they give to math students in September and December and March to measure their learning. Are they learning math? Are they getting better scores as they go through? So we compared the learning of the 2018 year to the 2019. This is extremely significant. The gray bar is the control classroom. The green bar is the biophilic classroom. Look at September when they first come in. These are the average test scores for the 125 students in the control classroom. That's their average score. Look at the average score of the kids in the biophilic classroom when they first come in September. They're almost identical. So we can't say that one class was really smarter than the other. They started at the same baseline. Then look what happens in December. Everybody improves. Biophilic classroom improves more. In March, control improves. Biophilic classroom improves more. So let's look at the average gain of the control classroom. 5.48 points difference, better. But look at the average gain in the biophilic classroom of those scores, 18.45. If we call that learning, the learning was 3.3 times better in the biophilic classroom than it was in the control classroom. And remember, they started with identical scores. And this is a large sample size. This is about 125 kids in each cohort. So just to summarize the findings, this is a very capsulized version of the study, and we'll show you where to go to get the study at the end. Stress reduction in the class experience was significantly higher in the biophilic classroom. Improvement in math test scores over a 7-month period was more than 3 times higher in the biophilic classroom. And you heard from the students and the teacher themselves how they felt in the space. So we're going to close just by saying we're very proud of this work. This is the first time that biophilic design has been tested as to its impact on learning. And you know, when we think about how we do what we do, and I still say to myself, what do we want our learners to become? What are the experiences that make that becoming happen? What are the spaces that afford those experiences? Now think about this. How do we design for what is innate to the learners? What does the biology of the learner tell us? And should we use that as a guide to help us design learning spaces? So with that, we'll close. Thank you for your attention. And please you can, the research is available online. One place to get it is our website. There's some others, ResearchGate and a BRIC-based AIA published. AIA funded this and they published this. So please help spread the word. Okay, thank you very much.